Hello, everyone. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, because we know people are joining us today from different parts of the world. My name is Pradeep Nayak, and I'm at the University of Waterloo in the Faculty of Environment. I'm representing here the Vulnerability to Viability Global Partnership, which is a global partnership that focuses on strengthening small-scale fisheries. And it is my pleasure to host this event today. So I would start by a few introduction to the series itself and to our distinguished speaker. And then I will invite our speaker today to give a talk, followed by questions and discussions from the audience. So just as an introduction to the Vulnerability to Viability Global Partnership first, it is a global partnership of transdisciplinary research and knowledge network with over 100 members from Asia, Africa, and internationally. The goal of the global partnership is to support small-scale fisheries in their transition from vulnerability to viability. And the way we define vulnerability and viability is not just in an economic or income way, but also to capture all aspects of human life that goes into the political, ecological, and social and cultural aspects. The B2B Global Partnership aims to identify the diverse factors and conditions contributing to the vulnerability of small-scale fisheries and engage collaboratively with small-scale fishing communities and other key NGO, government, and university partners to enhance SSF, that is small-scale fisheries viability. We are conducting transdisciplinary community-engaged research in 6 countries in Asia. That includes Bangladesh, India, Indonesia, Japan, Malaysia, and Thailand, and 6 countries in Africa. That includes Ghana, Malawi, Nigeria, Senegal, South Africa, and Tanzania. In doing so, the B2B partnership brings people and organizations together across physical, cultural, and disciplinary boundaries through a shared interest in addressing global change impacts on small-scale fisheries. The B2B thematic webinar series, the purpose for which we have gathered here today, is an initiative of the B2B Global Partnership to facilitate and generate high-level discussions on vulnerability and viability themes and topics within the context of small-scale fisheries. The goal is to feature academics, policy practitioners, and members of the civil society who have made significant contributions to the theoretical, practical, and policy aspects of small-scale fisheries, both locally and globally. B2B thematic webinar series takes place on the last Friday of every month, and it will be so throughout 2021. The series is available internationally through the live streaming on YouTube. Details regarding this monthly webinar is available at our website, which is www.b2bglobalpartnership.org. Today's talk is the 9th in the series of webinars planned for the year 2021. And it is my privilege to introduce Dr. Derek Johnson as our distinguished speaker today. Dr. Johnson is a professor of social cultural anthropology in the Department of Anthropology, University of Manitoba, Canada. He is also the head of the department in Manitoba. Dr. Johnson's expertise lies in the area of environmental economics, environmental and economic anthropology, political ecology, and social well-being. Sorry. In doing so, he focuses on small-scale fisheries in Asia and Canada, but his theoretical, thematic, and research leadership is global in reach. As an extraordinary scholar, Dr. Johnson has made tremendous contributions to the above fields of studies and scholarship. His contributions include numerous publications in the form of peer-reviewed journal articles and books, and the most recent book being The Social Well-Being and the Values of Small-Scale Fisheries, and another edited volume just in the making currently. His collaborative, interdisciplinary, and transdisciplinary research engagements promise to contribute tremendously to the national, regional, and global policy and practice involving viable social economies of dried fish. and you will hear a lot now when he starts to speak. Currently, Dr. Johnson leads the international partnership Dried Fish Matters as its project director and the principal investigator, which is supported by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. Dried Fish Matters conducts research on social economy of dried fish in 6 focused countries in South and Southeast Asia, all under Dr. Johnson's leadership. I'm extremely proud that Dr. Johnson is also a co-investigator and active member of the V2B Global Partnership. It is my honor to invite Dr. Derek Johnson to deliver a talk for the V2B thematic webinar that is titled as Vulnerability and Viability in Dried Fish Social Economies. Over to you, Derek. And
well, thanks so much, Prateep, for that generous introduction. It makes me blush a little bit to hear it. I really appreciate that. And I also really appreciate the overview that you gave of the V2V project, because that's actually a helpful backdrop for what I want to talk about. So I'm going to share my presentation now, and let's get going with that. All right, so yes, and welcome everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here, and thanks very much, Prateep, for the invitation to join this V2V series. What I want to do today is to propose a kind of conversation between Dried Fish Matters and the V2V project. These are 2 big Canadian-funded partnership grant projects, which have a great deal of overlap between them. In terms of focus, the main overlap that we share is this focus on small-scale fisheries, and I'll talk a little bit more about that shortly. But also there are overlaps in terms of people who are involved in the 2 projects, and significant thematic overlaps as well. And so Prateep didn't mention it, but he's also a key player in the Dried Fish Matters project, and he's been particularly helpful in terms of bringing in participants in the Dried Fish Matters from the northeastern part of India and West Bengal in particular. So I want to recognize his role in the Dried Fish Matters project. And I want to also preface my presentation by saying that my engagement in V2V has been unfortunately somewhat peripheral, and that relates directly to the fact that I'm running this other large partnership grant. So I simply haven't had the time to be engaged in the V2B project in the way that I would like. And so I want Prateep in particular to keep that point in mind, because I'm going to be making some statements about what I see as core to the V2B project, and I could actually be wrong in those statements. And so I'd like Prateep and others in the V2V partnership to correct any sort of mistaken assumptions that I speak to in this presentation. I want to focus in the presentation on the title of V2V, that is Vulnerability to Viability. And you'll notice in my title that I've changed the middle term. I've changed it to Vulnerability and Viability, and I'm going to come back to that. There's a reason for doing that that I'll talk about in a minute. But this vulnerability and viability, to me, are a central bridge between DFM and V2V. And to me, these 2 terms are really at the heart of the shared sense of purpose that we have in this project. And so I want to make a big claim about vulnerability and viability, or vulnerability to viability. And then I want to move into a slightly smaller claim about that. But to me, vulnerability, the transition from vulnerability to viability speaks to a central theme in human life. As humans, we are constantly at various scales of our lives faced with threats to our abilities to live together, to earn an income, to be healthy, to be well. And this is a theme that, of course, is central at the very broadest sense to all of the great religions of the world. We are a vulnerable species, and we are, as individuals, as part of that species, vulnerable. So the world's religions address this fundamental sense of human fragility at the core of what they do. And particularly human fragility in the face of death. And so what I think the V2V project is doing, the V2V partnership is doing, is diving in to this deep, deep theme in human existence and applying it in the context of one particular area of human activity, and that is small-scale fisheries. So with that said, then let me move into a slightly more specific take on vulnerability and viability. So moving from the big sort of religious motivations for helping to deal with vulnerability and enhancing our resilience, psychological and community resilience, to how these themes play out in the context of small-scale fisheries. And so here I want to make a similar argument, and I want to argue that the small-scale fisheries literature very deeply taps in to these two paired ideas of vulnerability and viability. And really, perhaps the grand narrative of the small-scale fisheries literature is this recognition of the serious vulnerabilities that small-scale fisheries face, and indeed the growing vulnerabilities of small-scale fisheries. And the history of the small-scale fisheries literature is also replete with approaches that try to address that exposure to vulnerability that exists for small-scale fisheries. And so, as just a sort of iconic indication of the centrality of vulnerability to the small-scale fisheries literature, I want to go back to this famous idea that Daniel Pauly crystallized, in the late 90s, early 2000s. This is a slide from his Mara conference presentation in 2005, which captures this central argument that underpins the idea that small-scale fisheries are vulnerable. And he had this, he made this very empirically grounded claim that that fisheries around the world, and not just small-scale fisheries, but supplies as much to small-scale fisheries, are suffering from an ecological crisis. And his work provided that empirical foundation for the argument that small-scale fisheries face ecological crisis. And in the more social science literature, going back to work in the 1980s, 1990s, this is a main theme in the social sciences as well, the vulnerability of fisheries and small-scale fisheries to ecological crisis. Okay, so again, vulnerability, to my mind, central to the narrative that motivates work in small-scale fisheries, and particularly anchored in ecological crisis. But the other side of the coin is that social scientists and fishery scientists throughout this period from the 80s onwards, and in fact, going back earlier than that, have developed a wide array of different approaches to reinforcing, to buttressing, to strengthening the viability of small-scale fisheries. And so throughout, and here I'll focus particularly on the more social science literature, but throughout the period from the 80s onwards, there are an array of different, what I would call designs for improvement that emerge in the social science fisheries literature. So these come out, importantly, of commons theory. They resulted in a strong wave of work in the area of co-management in the 90s and 2000s, and they've continued to develop into the present. And so the V2V partnership reflects sort of the continued elaboration of ever more encompassing approaches to trying to support the viability of small-scale fisheries. And so this vision that Prateep presented at the beginning of a sort of a broad-ranging approach to sort of transdisciplinary engagement with trying to support the viability of small-scale fisheries is really, to my mind, one of the most recent phase in the evolution of attention to the viability aspect of addressing small-scale fisheries vulnerability that has deep roots. So I want to assert here then two things. And this is one point then where Prateep can correct me at the end of the presentation if I've gone astray. But in my reading and my listening to presentations about V2V, it seems to me that V2V is very much grounded in a social ecological systems perspective on viability and vulnerability. Okay, and so it's not to say that other aspects or other approaches are not involved, because of course they are. Governance, interactive governance is a key thread as well. And the commons roots of Prateep's thinking as well are very much there. But the broad canvas within which I see V2V is working is the social ecological systems perspective. The Dried Fish Matters project has a social ecological systems component to it, but that is a relatively minor player. The major player in the Dried Fish Matters project is the social economy perspective, which has a different orientation. And so I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. But just then to orient you as the audience to sort of the foundational reference points through which both of these projects aim at designs for improvement for small-scale fisheries. On the one hand, social ecological systems in V2V, and on the other, social economy in DFM. So I want to give a quick little vignette, little illustration of how the Dried Fish Matters project is addressing this core theme of vulnerability in its work, and in this case, in particular, in its work in Andhra Pradesh. And I want to give this illustration as a kind of warm-up before we get into a more conceptual discussion of the contrasts between V2V and DFM. So this is this little vignette that I want to present to you is based on research conducted by the District Fishermen's Youth Welfare Association. This is one of the Dried Fish Matters project partners in Andhra Pradesh in India. And over the course of the last 12, 16 months, the DFYWA's staff spent a considerable amount of time talking to women fish traders in Andhra Pradesh. And what they realized in that research was that these women fish traders' livelihoods are increasingly precarious. And so specifically, they brought to our attention that this particular group of economic actors in dried fish value chains in Andhra Pradesh are in an increasingly vulnerable situation. And that one strong indicator of that is that almost no fish traders are engaged in dried fish trading who are under the age of 40. So it appears that there is a movement afoot towards really the disappearance of small-scale women fish traders in this particular part of India. And that raises obviously serious questions about vulnerability. But the story is complex because while the women fish traders are, their livelihoods are increasingly at risk, we have to ask what the implications of that risk for these women traders are. So part of the story is that younger women no longer find entry into dried fish trading attractive. And that's for a couple of reasons. I would say that's for push and pull reasons. So the push reasons are very significant, and that is the conditions of work of these women fish traders are very, very difficult. They as the report makes clear, they spend sometimes 18 hours at work, and they're engaged in long distance travel. They're working in market situations where they're having to do competitive bidding with larger, better capitalized male traders. They lack access to basic sanitary facilities, so they have to go unbelievably long hours without being able to use a bathroom, which have health consequences. So this is a major push factor. Young women find this a very daunting prospect to go into this work. Another push factor is that that it's increasingly difficult to get fish, dried fish, because other purchasers are taking fresh fish landed from vessels and diverting them to other purposes. And then there's a pull factor as well, and that is young women look at this hard life and they say, well, if I get education, I could actually aim for possibly a desk job, which is much easier than working in the dried fish business. Or alternately, I could sell fresh fish, which has a much quicker turnaround time and actually is more profitable. So this little vignette then asks us to think carefully about vulnerability and viability, and to put ourselves in the shoes of the women who are contemplating whether to engage in the trade of dried fish or to engage in the trade of fresh fish or to move towards desk work. And so, by implication, who loses and who gains in a transition like this? Okay, so I'll leave the vignette there. There's a lot more we could say, and perhaps we could return back to it in the discussion. But I'm going to give you a number of other vignettes later in the presentation as well. And hopefully we can begin to pull some of these threads of the complexity that exist around vulnerability, viability, entry, exit, resilience, and so on. Okay, so very briefly then, the Dried Fish Matters project is a partnership grant project like the V2V project. The time period is 2018 to 2026. So it's a long project, which is a real luxury. It gives us time to watch history unfold. And so when we're thinking about questions like vulnerability and viability and the transitions between them, having a long period to work with is really important. So as you can see from the title of the full title of the project, Mapping the Social Economy of Dried Fish in South and Southeast Asia for Enhanced Wellbeing and Nutrition, social economy is up front and center in what we're doing. But again, be patient. I'll come back to social economy in just a minute. The focus, as Prateep mentioned, is South and Southeast Asia. And I've indicated the different places where we have research ongoing. And the circles on the map are the original sites where the project was located. The stars are places that have emerged since. And some of the stars represent really indeed very small studies, but nonetheless, studies that are indicating sort of the growing geographical scope of the project. So the tied to this social economy focus of Dried Fish Matters is a very broad value chain based analysis of the social economy of dried fish. And so we're using value chain to provide us a way of helping to map how dried fish flows across space. But we're using the value chain idea broadly in the sense that we're trying to couple onto the value chain perspective as a kind of structuring tool, a whole host of broader, let's say, transdisciplinary kinds of types of knowledge that will allow us to, again, to broaden value chain analysis. The project has a keen interest in food and nutrition, and particularly the degree to which dried fish are important to addressing the food and nutrition needs of particularly poor populations of consumers in these countries of focus. And within the Dried Fish Matters project, we have what until V2V came along was a kind of implicit V2V perspective, and I mean a vulnerability to viability perspective. And so the broad narrative of our project also shares this V2V orientation, a sense that dried fish food systems in South and Southeast Asia are increasingly stressed, and that we need to work on ways of enhancing the strengths, the capacities that lie within those food systems in order to continue to deliver the food, nutrition, security, and well-being benefits that dried fish brings to all of the consuming populations and the producing and processing populations around the region. And just as an important side note here, you'll note that I've written V2V in small v's. And I've done that throughout the presentation when I'm talking about the ideas of vulnerability and viability as opposed to the V2V partnership project. When I refer to the V2V partnership project, and I'm using I use big V's. All right, just a little detail of importance. Okay, so that's a very, very basic background to the Dried Fish Matters project. And maybe one last point there. We treat dried fish in an encompassing way. It is not fish that are strictly dried that we are looking at. It can also be wet fish, but it cannot be fresh fish or fish that require refrigeration or freezing for storage. So it's fish that can be stored in a processed form at room temperature. Okay. So here I want to sort of dive more deeply into the connection between V2V and DFM. I've already made sort of the broad argument about the centrality of vulnerability and viability to DFM as a way of bridging over to V2V. Here I want to argue the point basically that Prateep started with about transdisciplinarity. Both V2V and DFM are appropriately what I would call relational projects, as large-scale international collaborations, partnership grant projects. They are about relationship building in a whole host of different senses. Okay, so they're about building new personal relationships, reinforcing old personal relationships. They're about building institutional relationships. They're about conceptual innovations, conceptual building, and that's what I'm going to be focusing on primarily in this presentation. They're about methodological connections and innovation. They're about spatial interconnections and bringing together groups and people and organization across space and making insights based on comparisons across space. And they're about innovating, making new relational connections between different ways of addressing viability. So that's the applied, there are applied implications to the work we do that are really important. So all of these are relational qualities of our two partnership grant projects. And broadly, we could say that they're big tent kinds of projects. They're projects that don't seek to restrict and limit and focus as much as weave new possibilities around core ideas. And I really think the idea of transdisciplinarity speaks to that. It's about bringing in knowledges of a whole different range of types into growing our understanding of particular problems like vulnerability and viability in small-scale fisheries. And so this image that I pulled from one of Prateep's recent publications, I think speaks to this quality of relationality. It's about, in this picture, in this image, Prateep has done an incredible amount of lateral thinking in terms of relationally connecting in a logical way ideas from the Millennium Development Goals, or the Sustainable Development Goals, and some core ideas in social ecological systems thinking and small-scale fisheries thinking, with the Sustainable Development Goals as sort of reference points around the circumference of the circle, and then elements for the analysis of what it is that's important to small-scale fisheries in the middle of the circle. Okay, and then suggesting that we can use the Sustainable Development Goals as a set of reference points again that can help us sort of map this transition from vulnerability to viability. And so again, the point here is that this sort of emphasizes to me how V2V in particular has this relational quality in its project design and in its great ambition. So now I'm going to move on to some conceptual relationship building, as I had promised. Okay, so I'd said earlier that I root V2V in a social ecological systems foundation, and Dried Fish Matters in a social economy foundation. Here I want to bring in a third area of inspiration, and that is the area of political ecology. And I want to suggest that social ecological systems, social economy, and political ecology all have critical things to say about vulnerability and viability. And so I've put vulnerability and viability at the heart of the intersection of three areas of these three approaches to thinking about small-scale fisheries. I'm not suggesting here that these are the only approaches, but I think these are the approaches that are most relevant to the discussion today of the relationship between V2V and DFM. And so political ecology is the sort of novel element here. We both in V2V and DFM have had to prioritize a particular approach. But I would say that political ecology is, to some extent, the hidden partner in both projects. But it's a crucial hidden partner for reasons that I'm going to talk about in just a second. So here's a pretty busy slide that in which I'm going to try and sketch out some of the core conceptual ideas that are the foundations to the V2V and the DFM projects. Okay, so I promised I'd say something a little bit more about what social economy means. So let me start there in the bottom left part of this picture. So the idea of social economy is actually a very simple one at the core. This is an idea that I bring in particularly from economic anthropology, but it's also one that's shared widely across the social sciences and in human geography, economic sociology, for example. The idea here is that, and this also goes back to what Prateep said at the beginning of the presentation, that human economic relationships are not just material economic transactions around individual self-interest. Economic relationships are much more than that. Economic relationships are embedded in broader sets of factors that condition how humans live their lives, what humans see as valuable. The relationships that humans deem important to them. And those can be relationships with other people, with ideas, with groups, with religions, with the environments they're part of. And so in that sense, social economy as a recognition of the embeddedness of economic activity, economic behavior, economic rationality, actually shares a logic with social ecological systems thinking as well. So you could move this point about economies being embedded up to the intersection between social ecological systems and social economy, because from social ecological systems thinking, we recognize that economic behavior is also conditioned, shaped by human relationships with the environments that they draw on for sustenance and for well-being. Okay, the second point then, going back to the point I made a couple slides ago about social economy in relationship to value chains, is that the social economy approach takes the core, the real contribution of this value chains idea about how economic activity unfolds across space in the flow, for the upstream flow from production to the downstream end of consumption. And it takes that structuring of economic activity and suggests that there are all sorts of additional layers that we need to consider when we think about these value chains, and that those layers add a kind of horizontality to value chains, that there are relationships amongst, for example, traders that may be based upon kinship or past history or friendship or particular kinds of credit, which we really need to understand in a horizontal way as opposed to a vertical way. And so it's the bringing together of the vertical and horizontal around value chains that is one of the sort of the useful insights that I think a social economy perspective brings to the Dried Fish Matters project. And so conceptually then, these are two sort of fundamental reference points that we use in the Dried Fish Matters project for thinking about economic behavior around dried fish production, trade, consumption, processing, retailing. Okay. Okay, so that's a very brief introduction to social economy. So I think I will actually move over to political ecology for just a second and then go back up to social ecological systems, because I want to mention this value is plural point. And so I put this at the intersection between the social economy and the political ecology circles. This relates to the core idea of social economy in the sense that values that are realized through economic activity and that inform economic activity are not just narrow economic values. They are also those other values that I was just referring to. They're ecological values, they're kinship values, they're social relational values, they're subjective values. And so it's in terms of horizontalizing value chains, it's useful to sort of question the value part of value chains and to recognize the value chains are constituted not just by commodity value, but also by other kinds of really important values that we have to think about when we think about the value or the viability and the vulnerability of those value chains. Okay, so let me pause and not go into political ecology yet, but go up to social ecological systems thinking. And again, this is what I see as the anchor to vulnerability to viability. And so core to the social ecological systems perspective is that human actors and the environments within which they live, they act, are in relationships. And these relationships are ones that are fragile, and that they are fragile in both ways. You know, that human actors are vulnerable in the face of environmental change, but at the same time, human actors also drive that environmental change. So there's a relational dynamic at the heart of social ecological systems thinking, which relates directly to the third point down here on uncertainty. The dynamic quality of social ecological systems means that social ecological systems cannot be figured out in a definitive sense. There is always a sense of the unknown, the uncertain, that is part of that key quality of social ecological systems thinking. And I think a key contribution of this approach is to question linear deterministic approaches to managing human environmental systems. And so it's that necessity of creating adaptive strategies for enhancing the viability of human ecological systems that is attentive to uncertainty, to surprise. And so the idea of resilience then, to me, embodies that attention to uncertainty in efforts to achieve viability. And so social ecological systems thinking then, has built up this really theoretically robust approach to viability that's grounded in really the best ideas that have emerged from ecological thinking in particular, and really married them to thinking about the interaction from societies and ecologies. The final point I want to make about social ecological systems thinking that is really critical is that the social ecological systems thinking gives us a way of thinking about time that is really valuable. So I've used the word lumpiness. So for social ecological systems thinking, because of the qualities of uncertainty that prevail in these relationships between people and their environments, time doesn't proceed in a simple linear way. We don't see a simple progression of environmental degradation, or a simple progression of environmental improvement or economic growth or economic degradation. Rather, time is punctuated by moments of surprise, of transition that are often unpredictable. And so that attentiveness to that irregularity of change over time is really important, because it alerts us to the fact that pressures might be building within a social ecological system that could result in a negative transition, or alternately, from a viability perspective, potentially in a positive way. Okay, and then finally, with regard to social ecological systems, there is this idea of emergence as well, and that is that related to this recognition that our environments are uncertain. Emergence speaks to again, to this attentiveness, this openness to possibilities of surprise, and that knowledge can come together and relationships can come together in ways that are unexpected. And the system, the quality of the system itself is never fully defined. Okay, so that this is again about the dynamism that's at the heart of a social ecological systems perspective. Okay, and so that's an idea that I also think has a kind of connectedness to political ecology, because political ecology, rooted in part in ideas drawing from Marx, also recognizes that that there are moments of crisis in history where things can change very, very rapidly. So that's the lumpiness, and that there is always uncertainty, but also possibility in this sort of irregular progress of human relationships over time. So there's a kind of core conceptualization of time and change and possibilities for novel emergence that exist in political ecology as well. So what is it that I think is so important about political ecology that we need in both V2V and DFM? Well, that is a very careful theorization of the broader social, economic systems quality of the world that we live in, focused, particularly drawing on these ideas that originate with Marx around what is the nature of capitalism and how does capitalism operate? What, for example, is the commodity and what sorts of logic accompany the commodity as a key element of capitalism? So we need a theory, we need a theoretical reference point for thinking about capitalism as the broader social, economic, political system that structures our world at present. Political ecology provides that. Political ecology also, and this is complementary to the Marxian origins of some of its ideas, also brings in ideas around discourse, narrative, and what is nature and how do humans conceptualize nature. And so there's another area of discussion around particularly ideas about how humans think about nature and engage with nature that's also fundamental to political ecology. And political ecology puts foremost on the table the notion of power, and that human relations with each other and with the environment are not neutral relations. There are interests behind how we engage with each other around the environment, and that we need a notion of power in order to understand that, to understand how the best intentions for moving towards viability can be undermined by sometimes, often, hidden interests. Okay, there we go. That is, in a nutshell, how I see the relationship between these three areas, these three approaches to thinking about vulnerability and viability. They all provide very useful tools for thinking about what the system looks like, and some of the factors that shape vulnerability, shape viability, and really make human life worth living, okay? Or conversely, make it very difficult to live. That leads, so that theoretical discussion leads to a number of what I would call indicative questions. These are just some questions that I think are very important, but they're by no means all of the questions, or even a very small sampling of the questions that the intersection of these three approaches can bring to us. I want to underscore the question on the left, though, the one in the larger font. So the intersection of political ecology and social economy, and in fact, also social ecological systems thinking, that I think is really pushed by a political ecology perspective, is to ask, when we're thinking about transitions from vulnerability to viability, whose vulnerability are we talking about and whose viability are we talking about? So if I go back to the vignette from Andhra Pradesh from a few minutes ago, that's a critical question to think about when thinking about the transition from vulnerability to viability. Are we orienting ourselves to the vulnerability and the viability of the group of women who are involved in the dried fish, the small scale dried fish trade? Or are we thinking about the viability of younger women who are taking the fresh fish and selling it directly rather than drying it and then selling it? Or are we thinking about the viability of the broader dried fish or even fisheries, small-scale fisheries economic system? And so when we begin to ask questions about whose vulnerability and whose viability, we start to complicate straightforward narratives of transition from one to the other, because a political ecology perspective points out to us that there will always be trade-offs in designs for improvement to enhance vulnerability and viability. And this is also a lesson that comes strongly to us from a more feminist perspective as well, or a feminist political ecology perspective. You know, what are the contrasting interests of differently positioned people in a social economy? Men, women, but also older women, younger women, male producers, female buyers and vendors. Can we even achieve viability for all? Or do we have to think of, or can we think about some way of optimizing viability so as to minimize the losses, the vulnerability losses for across the board? You know, these are the key kinds of questions that emerge from considering whose vulnerability and whose viability. And so just to flag Madhu Galapathi's work on intersectionality, I think she's speaking to these questions. And you know, she's very much doing her research within Dried Fish Matters in a way that is highly complementary to V2V and to a political ecology perspective. Okay, so other questions that this Venn diagram of these three approaches raises. So in terms of schemes or development schemes or schemes for improvement, so a question we could ask at the intersection between social ecological systems and political ecology is how do deliberate interventions for improvement, particularly around enhancing, let's say, environmental health, shape the trajectory of change? Do such schemes enhance overall viability, or do they enhance the viability of one aspect of the broader system at the expense of the others? And then we go to the very bottom one. What would governance for viable small-scale fisheries social economies look like? This is a critical question. You know, these schemes for improvement, institutional schemes for improvement, or economic development kinds of schemes for improvement, how do we design those in a way that address environmental, social, economic, and equity goals all at the same time? That's a very big question, of course. But vulnerability and viability as reference points, and then questioning whose vulnerability, whose viability, sort of complicates a question like that in important ways. And then the last one is well-being our target here? And if well-being is our target, what does that mean for the strategies that we devise for moving from vulnerability to viability? So are we moving from vulnerability to well-being? So well-being is central to the V2V project. It's also central to the DFM project. We can talk about that more in the discussion. It's also a big question. Okay, now that's the heavy-duty, conceptually challenging part of the presentation, where I try to lay the foundations for some of the questions, or sorry, some of the ideas that I think join up V2V and DFM, and then link them to a number of, I think, productive questions. I had intended to go through a series of additional vignettes to illustrate overlaps or to reinforce my argument for the overlaps between V2V and DFM. I don't have time to go into these vignettes to the degree that I would like. So I'm just going to have to sort of pick and choose here. So because I'd really like to allow sufficient time for discussion. So there, basically, the logic is to start at the broadest level with point 1, and then to move through a series of just quick points. Now, number 4 is one that is the least quick, because I was going to show a video of one of our colleagues from the project, Tara Nair from Gujarat, but that I unfortunately think will take too much time, so I'll have to pass that over. Okay, so here's the broad scale vignette. So in terms of dried fish social economies, what is the big challenge in terms of, and here perhaps I should have said vulnerability to viability. What is the big challenge in moving from vulnerability to viability? This figure shows that challenge, and it's probably not immediately apparent to you what this figure is all about. So briefly, the lines, or the bars in blue are the relative number of the relative number of references in a large database that we've collected on dried fish globally, but organized by theme. And the green bars are the proportion of references, or no, so this is the number, yeah. Now I've got the numbers mixed up. This is, sorry, I've got the x-axis mixed up here, but numbers, regardless of numbers, what this figure shows is the relative proportion by theme of a sample of literature on dried fish versus a sample of literature broadly on fisheries, okay? And it shows that the comparative emphases in the two literatures is starkly different. And I want to focus on this theme in particular. So as those of you who work in fisheries know, in the general fisheries literature, attention to policy and governance is a major area of work. This is the viability stuff that I was talking about earlier, the commons work, the co-management work, the interactive governance work. It's a big part of the fisheries literature. However, if you look at the dried fish literature, it's virtually absent. So moving from vulnerability to viability in terms of dried fish social economies, there's a clear area of work here. There has not been enough attention to how to address the major problems that prevail around vulnerability in the dried fish the dried fish sector. Okay, and these are problems about threats to livelihoods. These are problems about diminishing availability of dried fish, and these are problems around food safety with regard to dried fish, among others. Okay, so again, there's a key area of work that's needed in terms of social economies of dried fish in order to address the vulnerabilities that are growing within that area. I'm going to skip this slide. Another vignette is comparing fermented fish in South and Southeast Asia. I've got Bangladesh on the left, Cambodia on the right, and these are preliminary findings from research in both places by the DFM Bangladesh team and the DFM Cambodia team. The point here, and related to what I just said, is that there are significant changes taking place in the social ecological system of dried fish in these two places. So in the Bangladesh case, we are the DFM Bangladesh team reports that this extremely culturally significant product, shidol, which is manufactured in the inland northern areas of Bangladesh. That's a fermented fish product. Traditionally, inland small fish are central to the production of this product. The DFM Bangladesh team tells us that that supply problems, basically a decrease in the availability of small inland fish, has led to the need to substitute marine small fish for the inland fish in this product, which is problematic. It's problematic potentially nutritionally. We don't yet know whether there's a nutritional difference between the two differently sourced small types of small fish, but we do know that culturally and socially it's problematic because the inland small fish are much preferred over the marine small fish in this fermented product. So there's a potential economic vulnerability emerging in this processing practice because of its supply-driven inability to meet consumers' preferences. Okay, so that's it's an illustration of a vulnerability and the need for attention to how to address this and enhance the viability of this particular processing practice. On the right, we have pictures of prahok in Cambodia, also a very important, extremely important fermented fish product central to Cambodian cuisine, deeply relished in the Cambodian palate. And here, what the DFM Cambodia team brings to our attention is, I guess I'll point out two important factors. One is that there are major large-scale infrastructural development schemes taking place on the Mekong River, which are interrupting the flow of water downstream to Cambodia, which are having serious impacts on the ecosystems of places like the Tonle Sap Lake, which are reducing the supply of fish for prahok. And a second point is that in relationship to larger changes in supply, there are broader social, cultural, economic changes taking place in Cambodia, which are leading to a move out of household level prahok production and what appears to be a transition towards more commercial prahok production. And this has a number of different consequences to it, one of which is just the sense of loss that older Cambodians feel about no longer having as much opportunity to, with their families during the prahok manufacturing season, produce prahok sourced from local water bodies. And so there's a whole shift in way of life around prahok production that seems to be taking place in Cambodia, which has subjective well-being consequences to it. Okay, now
Derek,
I'm going to stop.
yeah.
I'm just going to just Pradeep, let me just make my quick conclusions, and then I'll open it up for discussion. So, in conclusion, I just want to say that vulnerability and viability are foundational to narratives for small-scale fisheries, and by that token, they link V2V and DFM. At the same time, both Pradeep and I have an incredible privilege in being able to work with amazing partners and collaborators across the world and together we are telling new stories about vulnerability and viability that are enriching previous past stories, and this narrative that I've suggested has deep roots in small-scale fisheries. But for both projects, we're really only just beginning to pull these stories together. And so I've just given you a few fragments of some of the exciting insights that are emerging from DFM. In a few years, we're going to be in a position, I think, to really tell some quite important, wonderful new stories and really deepen this strong narrative of vulnerability to viability in small-scale fisheries. And I haven't said much about, I haven't said a lot about governance, but I know that that's a key theme in V2V, but it's absolutely central to the transition from vulnerability to viability and deserves a lot more thought. Okay, I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much, Derek, for covering such wide range of topics pertaining to both projects, and actually raising a lot of questions and issues that we would like to follow in the future days, in terms of how we work together as part of these two projects. And so I know we have limited time, but we would move on to audience questions. So you can write your questions in the chat, and then we will read it out to Derek, and Derek would answer. So we have one question that is here from Nguyen Richard. Just wondering how one can conceptualize the political ecology component for both large-scale industrial fisheries and small-scale fisheries in developing countries with institutional complexities.
There's no thumbnail answer to that question because this is a major theme within the broader fisheries literature. So, I mean, we could certainly address this question with reference to sort of neoliberalism and the influence of neoliberalism in terms of fisheries governance across the world. But let me anchor the answer to this question in relation to one of the cases I was going to mention, and that's there's a strongly growing concern in India in particular about the relationship between the industrial fish meal sector. So very much a central sector from an industrial side. That is, so fish meal as a commodity that is produced in order to support, traditionally was used for poultry feed, but in the contemporary period, it's used for aquaculture. And so there's considerable concern that industrial fish meal production, very much based in capitalist logic of commodity production, is presenting a huge political ecological risk to ecologies, but also to small-scale fisheries in India and elsewhere. And so what I wanted to mention when I was going to bring that case up is that in DFM, there is actually a bit of a debate about the fish meal sector in terms of the very viability even of the fish meal sector. And so I say that because on one side, one of the voices in DFM is saying that, in fact, the fish meal sector cannot compete because the price it can offer for fish meal is not competitive with the price of the same fish being sold directly for human consumption. Okay. On the other side, we have, and so that argument comes from Andhra Pradesh. On the other side of India, from Karnataka, we have an argument saying that, in fact, evidence shows that the industrial fish meal sector is vacuuming up increasingly large proportions of the available small fish that are being caught in Karnataka. And so this is an unresolved debate, but it does, I mean, to answer your question, it's one illustration of how an industrial logic of production really, I would say, that could be interpreted as from a neoliberal perspective or a neoliberal analytical perspective, is causing a serious vulnerability threat to small-scale producers and women traders and consumers from a nutrition point of view in India, and addressing the viability of small-scale fisheries in that context is a major, complex, wicked problem.
Thank you, Derek. I see the questions have started to flow in from our live stream. So next question is by Elham Mohammadi. Visualizing the V2B framework, can we consider the social economy aspect to be the same as the behavioral economy? If not, can you please elaborate on the differences?
Okay, so I'm not an economist, so I wouldn't be able to answer this question as a behavioral economist. So I would say that the social economy perspective has a behavior component to it. And so understanding that idea from a more anthropological perspective, the way economic actors engage, the way they behave as they engage in their economic activities is conditioned by particular contexts. So their life experiences, their relationships with other people who are involved in that particular sector shapes their behavior. So I think behavior has a useful analytical role in thinking about social economy, but there are different ways of conceptualizing behavior. And I think a more neoclassical economist would think about behavior quite differently than the way I think about it. But for me, behavior is about sort of embodied practices, culturally embedded, relationally embedded, and subjectively significant.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Next question is from Aliou Shal from Senegal. Is the power relationship between these founding factors static? Does the market or capitalism impact on the transformation system today in the same way as it did a few decades ago? In other words, is the way in which these founding factors interact not subject to a certain dynamic contingent on their changing context?
Well, I think this is another question that would require some careful thought, but I think I would sort of, off the cuff, I would answer it in two ways. One is that social science does suggest that there are certain regularities in capitalism that we need to pay attention to. And so these are, I think the commodity captures one of those regularities. There's a certain logic to what commodities do, the kinds of simplifications that commodities represent, and the ways in which commodities often reduce out a lot of the human dimensions of economic relationships. And so, and from that point of view, there are regularities that we can see across time. But the social economy perspective and political economy and social ecological systems thinking are also, they're about context. And we can only understand how the sort of structuring impacts of capitalist development unfold in particular places by paying attention to that context. And so, even the contrast between what may be going on with fish meal production on the Indian East Coast and on the West Coast illustrates that commodity logics are also contextually embedded.
Yeah, definitely. Next question is from Madhu Galalapati, Canada. Could you reflect more on the relevance of the new insights generated through the project on various policies within and across DFM countries and beyond?
Wow. Okay, so I might have to give a weasel answer to this one, because the project design for DFM has the policy recommendations or the reflections on policy, governance, and development. So within the project, we've actually broken out policy into three areas, or the policy or the governance arena into three areas, let's say. So we were talking about policy, governance, and development as it's useful to distinguish those three areas, we argue. But our systematic attention to those three areas is something that we intended more for the second phase of the project. The first phase of the project, what we call the scoping phase of the project, was a taking stock exercise. So it was getting it's ongoing. It is trying to get a basic understanding, a basic overview of the social economy of dried fish in South and Southeast Asia. And part of that taking stock exercise is also analyzing the policy environment, the governance environment, the development environment. But that process of collating, analysis, interpretation, and then recommendation is very much in early days. So I think I suppose what would be ideal would be for me to be able to come up with some quick insight into something that's emerging already. But honestly, I'm a bit leery about doing that because I feel like I'm not really equipped to do that yet. Mm-hmm. So it's a good question, but maybe you could ask it to me again in 3 years. Sorry, Madhu.
Yeah. Okay. Before you conclude, Derek, we don't have any questions from the audience now, but I'm just, out of curiosity, I wanted to ask you something with in relating to governance. In your proposal to work on SES, social economy, and political ecology, and the hybridization of those three kind of intersecting areas in the context of vulnerability and viability, what do you see as the role of governance? And I know you could not get to that point in your final slides, but is governance as an umbrella approach that helps in how these intersections between these three areas might work and help in the critical hybridization of kind of approaches out of these three? So how do you see the role of I know I mean you didn't talk about it, but your role in the scholarship of interactive governance and the work that you have done has been very critical. And so, what's your perspectives on that?
Well, yes, I mean governance is something I've thought about a lot, and I had toyed with the idea of including a fourth circle for governance, but then I didn't think it was really the same. It's the same kind of approach as the other three. I feel like governance actually cuts across all of them, and so governance. Okay, one other point before I carry on with my answer is that one way in which governance is similar to the other three approaches is that I also see governance in the interactive governance sense as fundamentally a relational enterprise. So interactive governance is attuned to the uncertainties and emergence that I was talking about that social ecological systems has. So interactive governance is not a template-based approach. It is a processual approach. And in that sense, the processual quality of interactive governance embeds that relationality, but also has that openness to addressing vulnerabilities in context. And so the other part of my answer is that critical to a governance perspective is that it's a recognition that humans collectively can solve problems, that human institutions are a critical reflection of what we do as a species, of our quality as a species, our capacity to work together to collectively improve our lives. And that's the hopefulness of interactive governance. But it's also really important to pair interactive governance or governance thinking in general with the political ecology circle, because governance is not a neutral thing. It is a thing which balances interests. And sometimes those interests are subversive of the common good, of the general good. And so governance also should not be naive. It needs to be wary as well.
Yeah, I was going to bring to it an end. We have two questions. Maybe I will just read these two questions, and if I can request everyone to stay for another couple of minutes, so we can. I'll read these three questions. First is from Faluke Ariola from Nigeria. Focusing on food safety as a vulnerability challenge in small-scale fisheries, could you relate this with governance and certification of fish products and how this affects social economy of SSF? The second question is from Dilanti Koglagama from Sri Lanka. Climate and COVID-related shocks appear as major forms of vulnerabilities, questioning the viability in dried fish economies. Are we paying adequate attention to these critical issues in the global context, new issues? The third is Mr. Patnaik from India. Does political ecology critically question whether new governance mechanisms can improve the environmental performance and wider distributive aspects of fish production in the region? I know you need a couple of hours to deal with it. If you can have a brief answers connecting those three.
Okay, so certification is a very important issue for dried fish social economies, because there's a problem. There's a big problem, and that is that there are all sorts of contaminants in dried fish products, which sometimes make it impossible to export them. As an example. But there's another side to certification as well, and that is certification can also impose barriers on small-scale producers, which can, in effect, make them more vulnerable and exclude them. So it's a double-edged sword, and so that's a governance problem. That's a wicked governance problem. How to meet the needs of small-scale actors while also not excluding them through improving product quality. Delante's absolutely right that climate and COVID are both very good examples of the lumpiness of change that I was talking about earlier. It's a pity that I didn't have time to show Farah's little video presentation, because she talks explicitly about climate shock as something that is very serious for small-scale dried fish producers, processors, traders. But she pointed to a cyclonic event in Gujarat, and we're familiar with those in Orissa and West Bengal as well. And the increase of those possible events, major concern for fishers and small-scale fishers. COVID, there I would could talk about this for a long time, but I think one thing that COVID has of interest is changes to value chains. And so COVID has facilitated a shift towards online retail of dried fish, and that raises significant questions about whose vulnerability and whose viability. Can women who are illiterate engage in online retail or not? And are they going to suffer as a consequence? And then political ecology, new governance mechanisms. I mean, yes, I would say yes. So I could link this to the first point, actually. Political ecology, a new governance mechanism is certification. And political ecology has a lot to say about the implications of certification practices for small-scale producers. So yes, political ecology can very effectively be mobilized to critically evaluating the vulnerability effects of new governance mechanisms, and particularly about environmental performance. I'm going to leave it there, Prateep, because I can't answer that in 30 seconds or less.
Yeah, And I believe, there will be an opportunity to talk to Sarmista soon.
Great.
Thank you very much, Derek. This has been a wonderful, to get to those critical points about vulnerability and viability, and also to engage in a rich discussion, like this. And I'm sure that we will continue these discussions in other forums and in future as well. And there's lots to do as DFM and B2B, and both in the conceptual and the other areas. So I'm looking forward to that. And thank you very much for making time today. And thanks to the audience that have joined from every corner of the world, and for your wonderful questions and engaging with Derek today on this platform. Before we just go, I'm requesting Seville, who is our project coordinator for Vulnerability to Viability Global Partnership, to bring up the poster for our next month's talk, as we always do. So please join us on the 29th of October for another wonderful talk in this series by Cornelia Nguyen. She's going to talk about the Small-Scale Fisheries Academy as a source of operational support to the Small-Scale Fisheries Guidelines, which is FAO guidelines. So we are all looking forward to that, and we invite you to join us, just about in a month's time from now, and using the same platform. And we look forward to engaging with you again. And thanks very much, everyone, especially Derek. Bye-bye.